if you want to have a conversation about what we're going to talk about now, for example, with anyone over 50, you can probably have it. But if you try and have it with most people under 50, you can't have it. You can't even have the conversation because of the way in which education has, well, effectively brainwashed. It's a very clumsy word to use, but the level of political, sociological, philosophical propaganda that's come through the system. It's partly to do with what cultural Marxism has called the long march through the institutions. They've reached everywhere, and they've filled people's heads with information and patterns of ideas that dislocate them from reality. I think that's the real difficulty. You say, look, even to the extent that politicians are afraid to tell you who a woman is, there's hardly any greater dislocation of basic reality than that. I think the best reason for the process by which it happened is the cultural Marxist one, because there really was a group of people called the Frankfurt School who decided that Marx's economics weren't good enough. And if they wanted this totalitarian revolution, they needed to have a plan B. And plan B was to present dialectical materialism in a cultural rather than economic context. And so the culture wars started, and they started quite early. All the political correctness goes back quite a long way. But what's extraordinary is the way in which people swallowed it. And I spent 25 years teaching at Britain's probably most radical left-wing university. And round about 2000, well, two things happened. First of all, I became alert to what Islam was intending to do at the turn of the millennium, because I had Muslim friends. I was involved in fairly high-level conversations between Islamic, Christian, and Jewish representatives. And they told me that their intention was an Islamic Europe through immigration. And I couldn't believe it. And when they told me the statistics that already by about 2004, they had 50% of people under 16 in 7 or 8 major towns who would eventually vote for Sharia law, I realized that democracy and demography would present part of the country into their hands. And so by the year 2000, it was clear that Britain was going to become a new Lebanon, just because of the numbers. And when you said this to people, they just laughed. And I said, but look, here are the numbers, and here are what my friends tell me, and here is what Islam is and what Islam says, and here is what Islam has done. What hole in the jigsaw are you missing? But still, they couldn't get their heads around it. And then about 10 years later, I realized that what we then called the political correct agenda was going to stop you saying some things. And along with Peterson, who's been so helpful to many of us, by showing us that if you can't say things, you can't think things, mainly because most of us, we all have limitations in the way we think. By about 2010, I could see that I could see that the political correctness was going to stop us talking about things. And so I went looking for the solution. I don't know how many people knew about the Frankfurt School in 2010, but I didn't. And so, then I read about it and I thought, whoa, this stuff is crazy. But if the long march through the institutions is really going to work, and above all, it's chosen to use our preoccupation with sex and with gender to get at us, then we're in real trouble. And I then discovered I was in so much trouble because I began by being very pro-LGBTQ plus for all kinds of kind of normal reasons. But then when I discovered some of the implications of what was going to happen, babies being sold, bought and sold in order to make gay couples feel more accepted without any concern for the human rights of a child, who at the very least ought to have the right to access to their biological parents rather than be constructed as a kind of social add-on. I then resigned from my university post because I didn't want to get sacked, because as I was talking about these things and asking about them, I could feel the kind of the dead hand of censorship moving. So I left. And then during the next 10 years, of course, the whole woke thing